Hello, everyone. This
Hello.
is Kompot. This is a very special episode of the TekWars Fan Network podcast. We're going to be just hanging out. It's a nice summer night. You can listen to this while you doze off. And we got a special guest to join us around the fireside. It's 0HP Lovecraft from Twitter. Say hello.
Hello. I am, in fact, from Twitter.
He is. He also has a WordPress blog, which people can find at where?
Same as my name. 0hplovecraft.wordpress.com.
Very good content on his Twitter. I highly recommend you follow him. And what's your Twitter at? You want to spell that out for people?
Oh, sure. It's 0x49FA98, which, if you punch it into a hex color tool, is kind of an ugly shade of green.
What was the motivation for that, for going for that shade of green?
To be honest, I just wanted something meaningless.
I can respect that.
Yeah.
You are using some voice disguise here, if our listeners can't tell. It's because I think a lot of what we talk about, people don't want you to reveal this information.
You know, I think it's not as risky as maybe I make it in my head, but I sort of like the mystique.
No,
Be too careful.
That's respectable. I wanted to maybe talk to you about some cryptids and maybe share some spooky stories about that. I mean, are you well versed in cryptids?
Wait, what's a cryptid?
I'm not as well versed as yourself, quite honestly. I learned a lot about cryptids from the Kompot Twitter account, in fact.
I'm happy to hear that we can spread the word that way. I appreciate the HP Lovecraft aesthetic. I mean, that's something, I don't know if you have been following this, especially in like the sort of literary community, like the college, the state school, literary departments are really against HP Lovecraft. It's like their banner motto thing, like one of the main authors that gets targeted.
Oh yes, his stories are good, but his views are so problematic. And let's not talk about his cat.
I saw a great comic on Twitter that someone just had made that he was in a dark alleyway buying an N-word pass from a mysterious person. And then he saw a cat in the alleyway, says, "What should I name it?" And then he looks at his N-word pass.
That's really good. I think that, I don't know if you've ever read Radish Mag, but he has a really long article where he goes to a lot of the letters that Lovecraft wrote. What many people don't know is that he wrote a small amount of fiction relative to this vast library of personal letters. He really just, his epistolary output was quite high. And so he goes through all the letters and sort of puts him on trial and says, was H.P. Lovecraft a racist? I'm not going to reveal the answer.
Yeah, Radish Mag. Everyone should check that out. I remember that piece. I mean, is Radish Mag still publishing stuff?
Oh no, not in years. But his corpus of work is excellent, and I still find myself returning to it sometimes.
Yeah, this is a classic kind of NRX blog from back when everything was really on WordPress. And it was Radish Mag, and they posted some of the best stuff to come out of that.
Yeah, what I really like about him is he doesn't editorialize very much. He really just presents a lot of excerpts from different texts and lets other people tell the story, often philosophers or even, people who were just giving reports of what their life was like journal entries, all kinds of found material, first-person sources.
Yeah, and I understand. I mean, I haven't read the Lovecraft correspondence at all, but I mean, I understand that he obviously corresponded a lot with like Robert E. Howard. So, do you have any opinions on the Conan stories as well?
I've only read a little bit of Robert Howard, but one of the anecdotes that I really like about him is he would read or he would recite everything that he wrote, all of his Conan stories. He'd memorize them and speak them aloud over and over and over again, because he wanted all of his work to have the power of an oral epic. And I think that's a really cool technique. It's something I've tried to do a little bit myself.
I really enjoy the Conan stories. I honestly think that I like him somewhat more than H.P. Lovecraft. I guess of H.P. Lovecraft stuff, the stuff that I like most is the stuff that's inspired by Lord Dunsany. Are you familiar with him?
I can't say that I am. Which works were inspired by Lord Dunsany?
The dream, like the earliest writings, like the dream cycle stuff, I think is what that period is called. But especially, do you know the one where it's an ancient civilization and there's someone who's eternally young, who's like eternally a kid?
That one is not ringing a bell, actually. I may have missed that one.
But there's some good ones, or the one that's like with the monuments that are built around the lake, and then the monuments all. There's the two cities, and one of them has like fish people, and one of them has humans, and the humans kill all the fish people and destroy their city, and then like one night the ruins of the city bring back the fish people, like devils or something, and they destroy the human civilization. Do you know that one?
Spooky.
That's a running theme in his work. To be honest, I tend to read everything by a particular author in very rapid succession when I like that author, and it all blurs together. And it makes me think of Dagon, which, he would write these little 2 or 3 paragraph pieces and just kind of present an image. I think Dagon, obviously, was a real deity to like Babylonians or Sumerians or something like that. But he also makes him a god of these fish people. It makes me think of that.
Yeah, it's that sort of style, mostly about like the ancient civilization kind of part of it, where it's more of an ethereal kind of thing about some, Sumerian, Egyptian, like the one with the cats.
The cats in Self.
Yeah. And that's kind of the Lord Dunsany stuff, and he was like a more of a Victorian, like kind of very early fantasy writer, and he wrote some really cool little stories like that I just loved. And he also did a lot of like mythology, world building stuff that was like kind of proto Tolkien.
Yeah, I love his mythology, and you can sort of see it traced through a lot of his work. He references the same gods, the same monsters, the same places. I've been very interested in the Dream Quest Unknown Kadaf.
I read that.
Which I think, is his longest work that sort of is set in the Dreamland. And if you read it, the plot is strange and very, very mechanical. It just over and over, the same little tensions arise and get resolved, but each time it's in a different place. It's like it's like a video game. He has to go here, he has to find this, he has to go there, he has to find that. He goes on a ship, he goes to the moon, he comes back. And there's very little tension in the whole thing. It's just kind of this endless exposition of places. But if you read it, it is dreamlike.
Yeah, I know. I had this exact same thing when I read it. I actually was not able to finish that one, because it felt like very tedious in a way, but also you could say something for it being, a function of what the content was.
Yeah, I mean, it is truly dreamlike. Like when you have a dream, it's that same sort of disconnect where, oh, suddenly you know something, and this is true, and that is true. And whatever the first idea that comes to your head, that's the truth, and you know it with your whole being. It's like that.
Yeah, I really always, I have a lot of respect for works of art that in general, in their structures, recreate what the book is about or what the song is about or anything like that. Like when the structure is sort of determined by the subject matter, I think that's like when a work of art really becomes self-reflexive and it gains a lot of depth from that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my favorite personal author, despite my nom de guerre, is actually Borges. But I came to Borges through The House of Leaves, which I don't think is a very good book. But I read it, and then people on the internet said, oh, if you like that, well, you should read Borges. And both of them sort of played a lot with structure like that.
Oh, absolutely. He has some really great stories. I'm not super well-versed in him. He's not the kind of author where I've read everything that he wrote, but I did always enjoy the one about the guy who's rewriting Don Quixote.
Oh, yes, Pierre Menard, one of my favorites.
Yeah, what's the whole story of that one again? It's been a long time since I read it.
Well, the story... So Borges was very famous for inventing books or scholars or whole epics, not actually writing them, but imagining them, and then writing about them as if they were real. So he'd write a critique of a made-up book, or he would write about a debate between two scholars, about a third scholar, and that scholar didn't even exist. And maybe none of them did, in fact. So I enjoy the way that he played with those kinds of themes.
I've read The Labyrinth, of course. I've enjoyed that story very much. By Borges.
Well, the book Labyrinth, I think, had a number of short stories. Maybe you're thinking of I don't know, there's quite a few.
It was one where he was stuck in a dream for what seemed like eternity. You mentioned Gnostics. I don't recall.
Yes, Gnosticism was a theme that he liked. But back to Pierre Menard, really briefly, if I could, because I think the story is very good. In Pierre Menard, the idea is that a man decides to write Don Quixote exactly as Cervantes wrote Don Quixote, word for word, but 100 years or 200 years later, something like that. So the idea is that the words, although they are exactly the same, every word is the same, have totally different meaning when Pierre Menard wrote them versus when Miguel Cervantes wrote them, because Pierre Menard had a different life. There have been different literary and historical developments. So the idea that he could just write the Quixote exactly the same is incredibly audacious. And it's a truly a masterpiece. It is a different work. It is not the same Don Quixote, even though it's identical.
Have you familiar with the Encyclopedia of like South American Nazis?
No. That sounds fascinating.
No, it's a book by Bolano. I don't know if that's the exact title, but he has one that's made up entries for South American Nazis that are all fictional characters.
Is it Nazi literature in the Americas?
Yes, yes.
That's great. I've never heard of it, but it sounds really good, actually.
There's another early unfinished novel that he wrote that was published posthumously, and it's called The Third Reich, I believe. And I'm really into that one because a guy goes on vacation and he gets really absorbed with playing an actual real-life board game, a war game called The Third Reich, which is one of the most complex World War II board games. and he becomes obsessed with playing it with a villager who is like some weird kind of, I think he's like a German kind of like South American guy.
These things are so fascinating. I mean, the whole world inside of something like that. Imagine being that person. Imagine going to Costa Brava and becoming obsessed with a hideously complicated board game. I can't even imagine doing that. But I can imagine a person who would.
Have you ever seen the movie The Ninth Gate?
No, I don't believe I have. I don't watch too many movies.
What's your opinion on is there a particular reason that you don't watch movies, like you have an aesthetic disagreement with the genre of film, or you just don't get around to it?
Honestly, it's probably a lack of patience on my part. I like to read, and I feel I can read very fast. But with a movie, it forces you to slow down, and sometimes the author will spend, especially with artsy movies, like it seems like a rule that the better the movie, the slower the camera has to pan, and the longer we have to linger on the objects that are being presented to us, and that's fine. I get it intellectually, but to be honest, I just I zone out. I'm too quickly pulled into my own head, into my own thoughts with a movie most of the time.
I can appreciate that. That's how I feel with video games, but I will say that The Ninth Gate is a BAP approved movie, I believe. I've seen him post references to it on numerous occasions. It's a Johnny Depp movie by Roman Polanski, where he's a rare book dealer who's sent on a quest to authenticate a cursed manuscript from like 1688 or something that was supposed to have been written by Satan. And there's like 3 copies in the world, and he has to go and travel around and find the other owners to investigate which is the real copy.
I could get to that.
I highly recommend it to any listeners out there. Like I said, I do believe that BAP likes this movie. It's my contention. But are there any films that you are into?
When I do watch movies, I tend to watch actually really wholesome entertainment. I like older movies. One of my favorites is My Fair Lady, the musical with Audrey Hepburn and Rex Harrison. It's a brilliant movie, I think. Well, it's not that old, 1964, but it's one of my all-time favorites. It's slow, actually, but it has so much wisdom in it, I think.
Yeah, I kind of have a thing for musicals sometimes. There's a few that I think are pretty good, like Seven Brides for Seven Brothers. But I'm not a huge fan of them in general. I don't know if...
I don't really do musicals.
Yeah.
This is if you need to watch Rex Harrison sing a song in the movie called Why Can't a Woman Be More Like a Man? And he uses irony very well. He, like, the whole sort of song, the character is very tongue-in-cheek. He's lamenting all the ways that women act like women, and the entire time there's sort of this, like, well, can't live with them, can't live without them. He laments, like, if you forget your best friend's birthday, your friend is like, cool. But if you, God forbid, you should forget your wife's birthday, something like that. The whole song takes that kind of tone.
What do you think about... Because I would like to just also talk about, just in general, the aesthetics of films. Because my big problem with just movies in general is that it's impossible for it to be derived from like a single person's understanding of the idea of what an artwork is about. And the complexity of the productions means that there's no way that like the costume designer is always going to understand the vision exactly as the director understands it.
You think it's too many cooks in the kitchen type thing?
Yeah, I always appreciate when a work of art like it. That's why I like literature the most, I think, is because it does come from like a one person completely.
So I think some really small and kind of almost bad productions are like that. Maybe you've seen the movie Primer, which I think is overrated, but the guy made it for $1 million. It was his script. He was the star. He made it with a couple of friends, so the creative control was almost entirely his. And I think that's a movie that articulates a really coherent, nearly one-man vision. But it is rare, like you say. Certainly big productions, no.
I mean, would you agree with that? You're a literary man. I mean, do you feel that satisfaction that I feel when you feel like literary communication is really happening between an author and a reader?
I think when I read a book, if it's a really good book, and this happened to me with a number of authors, it's almost like their head, like you're running an emulation of that author in your mind. And especially when I was a teenager, I decided, for example, to read every book and news article and everything ever written by David Foster Wallace, which is a whole load of pretentious shit, I know. But I did it, and for a while, like for a little bit, I think, that author lives in your head. And I've done something very similar with C.S. Lewis and with Borges, certainly. And even, I would say, like, I've read every word of Unqualified Reservations, so perhaps Mencius Moldbug at the same time. And I think in that moment, you're not quite yourself. You're somebody else.
That reminds me of just some old tweets that I've seen that I think, like, Mena would used to say something along these lines of people who read books are cucks because you're basically having your mind controlled by the author and just thinking exactly what they think, which is, like, completely correct. But also, like, that's, in my opinion, the good thing about literature because of the emulation effect that you talk about.
Oh, Mena is such a poet, but I have to say, I think that what's the alternative? Because if it's not reading a book, it's not. Look, I can put the thoughts of a great philosopher in my head, and if it's not that, it's probably like the thoughts of a bunch of people. It's YouTube, it's Vox, it's NPR or some shit like that, right? It's just an aggregate of all the other crap, just echoing and recycling.
Oh, like, I love just that feeling, though. Like, the one author that I experience this with the most is Lawrence Stern and Tristram Shandy.
I did not finish Tristram Shandy, but I did read a fair portion of it.
But, like, after reading that book, a lot of times I find it hard to, like, not write like him.
Yes, I know exactly what you mean. When you read an author and it actually transforms the way your words come out, it's a strange sort of pleasure.
Does that happen to you in your writing process?
Oh, I think so very much. I mean, I don't have much knowledge in my head at all. I just have to search protocols. And when I want to write something, I just go find other people who wrote about that thing and I read them. And a lot of the time, it's a blend. It's curation. I don't think there's very much creativity in any one. A little bit. There's a tiny bit. But, genius is a sliver of the divine. And very few people have it at all. And when you do have it, you just maybe for a second you grab it. But mostly what you're doing is you're synthesizing. You're just synthesizing, you're digesting, metabolizing things you've read and experienced.
I 100% know what you're saying, and I agree with it. Is creativity, like, people focus way too much on originality And when an author is writing something, I think it's more just like arrangement of different things that they have latched onto for some reason. Like you form a kind of like a bulletin board in your head or something of like your idea, and you just collect stuff for it for a long time, and you put it all on the bulletin board, and then you sort of like jam it all together, and you just do your best to make it so that they fit together somehow.
Yeah, that's exactly what I do. I mean, for me, it starts with quotations. Like, it's why I actually love Twitter, because you can get so many different ideas from so many different people, and really they're just a lot of the time posting from a book they've read or a weird old article. And I love strange esoteric accounts and people with crazy occult ideas. It's great. It's great. I want all of that. I want to drink it in.
That's the power of the egregore and the autistic collective consciousness that there is. It's a real power, and it's a real underlying energy.
Yeah, there's an account I really love that I'm gonna shout out.
Okay, go ahead.
You maybe Land Shark. This guy comes up with the wackiest occult, like esoteric ideas. It's beautiful. Like I don't think anyone quite is their Twitter persona, but all the stuff that he says, it's so different that I find it very stimulating, even if I think it's like, oh, that's totally batshit. It's batshit in a really engaging way.
Okay, that's, at Land Shark Rides. You can go check it out. Outsider artist of bodybuilding and medicine, orthodox, dangerously Bulgarian, anti-Faustian, quote, in a place of tears, now we pour bullets.
Choice quote.
I get like a little like, when I am browsing Twitter a lot, I start to get like hungry for stuff. Like not food, but accounts and content. Where I just have like a hunger to absorb as much of it as possible. Like I see someone in like the fringes or the margins of my timeline, and they're posting about some weird shit, and then I'm just like, what's going on over there? Like I have to check that out and make sure that I get that in my collection.
So I'm sure you've seen some of these 4chan iceberg memes where, you know, there's like the top level, it's like the thing you see, and it's all these very basic things, and some of them are incredible, like from X or some of the conspiracy theory ones. And the people who make these macros, they're just making stuff up at some point. Like, these are not real conspiracy theories. No one actually has some of these conspiracy theories, but I read about them and I'm like, I want to know about that one. Like, please, someone invent that conspiracy theory.
The ones at the bottom of the iceberg.
The ridiculous ones.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because I feel like that's what Goethe always talked about, was that he had a big thing about like that art is like collecting. Like his main character, his self-insert into his literary world is just a guy whose name is literally the Collector. And he always does this thing where he refers to characters very generically as like their profession or something.
Life,
like
or
no like the Doctor, or like
right.
He'll always do that. And it's a big division in his work where some characters have particular names, and some characters have like generic names, and there's like some significance to it that I've never been able to completely understand, but it is there. And the one that he chose to put himself in was just the Collector, who just thinks that like basically everything in life is just collecting, and that like science is collecting and like art is collecting, and he thinks that's like the highest like kind of mentality that a person can have.
It's funny because in a way that's sort of like what the folk sense of autism is someone who's willing to just go through like a list of thousands of anything really. Like an image that's fresh in my head is one of these accounts, Tradical. He looks up everything he can about every Catholic saint and he posts it. And I don't think he's autistic in like the clinical sense. I don't really care, to be honest. But it's the idea that you just go through and collect that. Like, you just find the topic so fascinating, you want to know all of it. You want to know every piece of data.
Yeah, that's something that I've always, because that's something they a symptom of autism that they do use.
The absolute fixation.
Yeah, and collecting like your toy cars, your Matchbox cars or whatever.
Trains. And,
yeah. Mm-hmm. But that's like, in my opinion, what every great writer ever has done.
Yeah, certainly. I was going to ask you a little bit, because you talk about characters who get names and who don't. And I don't know if you yourself do much fiction writing, but for me, I struggle a lot to sort of conceive of characters who are not me. And it's like, I imagine I need other people in the story as props, as pivots, as plot points, and I try to give them an interior life. But I think that a lot of the time, it's just facade. You know, it's very thin, and it's almost like the people, like they aren't even there. And your comment about naming characters made me think of that, like a personal, an NPC almost versus a real character.
Yeah, but this is what's so interesting about Goethe is that there is like some of his works have this structure about like moving from the individual to the particular. Like in Wilhelm Meister, that's like his whole journey is that he goes through his like life journey, and the end of the book, he's like he's ascended into like a more generalized like worldview of things, and the last two parts of it are supposed to be very, he's elevated to like the highest form of community, and then that's when you start like getting the really general named characters who all start coming in. And so there is some like interesting thing there, but just based on like when you're talking about your characters' minds and stuff, that actually reminds me of a great book, and it's called Fictional Minds, and let's see, I'm just going to look this up quick so I can tell you the author of it, because it is Yes. Yes. I would highly recommend that you check that one out for the kind of, it's hard to articulate, but literary writing does have that property where it really is like a computer that simulates a person's mind in it.
Interesting. Yeah, this looks good. I'll definitely check this out. You and Logo both. Whenever I talk to either one of you, I end up with like 100 reading leads almost. And it's like, how am I ever going to track all these down?
Yeah, with me, with the book recommendations, just when you're talking about something interesting, it's like you can't always completely diverge and go off on a big tangent. So I just want to like cite a book and be like, there's a whole interesting discussion about this in like this book, and like if you want to know more, like click the link. It's like this is like Wikipedia hyperlink mentality.
Yeah, no, this is relevant to my interests, and it says he analyzes Thomas Pynchon, and that's pretty good. Psycholinguistics, all kinds of great words.
Yeah, do you read a lot of literary studies, or are you not? Do you denounce?
I denounce almost nothing. I denounce very little. But I mostly I read a little bit here, I read a little bit there. I try to just sort of get to the core of something, and then maybe I move on.
Yeah, with the academic books and studies, I feel like I never need the whole book. Like I feel like author had their dissertation and then they took it and they turned it into a book, and it's like once you read certain parts of it, it's like you can figure out the rest yourself.
Yeah, and it's probably more rewarding to do so. I do struggle quite a bit with Marxist language. Not with Marxist ideas, but there's this certain way, it seems, I don't know quite where the mind virus starts, but if you read anyone who calls themselves a Marxist, and you even get this, like, you get this with a lot of people who are self-styled accelerationists, but you can find it in older works too. It's like they just can't say anything. They have to say 50 words where one word would do the trick, and there's no, like, it's very impersonal writing, and all these nouns suddenly take on agency that they don't have. Abstract concepts become people to them. I have very little patience for it.
There's like 50 prefixes to a word that aren't necessary, like neo, hyper, something.
All that too. Like, I mean, even like Mark Fisher, for example. Like, I tried reading Mark Fisher, and I was like, I can't do this. Could have known that work like simplify, please. I think, and this is maybe ironic because I tend to be a bit long-winded, but I think if you can't summarize something succinctly, you don't really understand it.
That's my problem with it, is because it's so like mechanical. Like when I get accused, when I write something, I'll put up an essay, there's always like inevitably a couple of people who'll be like, why you talk like a fag? Like there's too many words.
Your shit's all retarded, man.
Yeah, and it's like, did you use the thesaurus? And I'm like, no, I just like read books, and like these are regular words to me that, I don't consider to be hard words. And when you read something that's like Alexander Pope or like David Hume or something, they have this whole other sense of like what writing is about, where they treat you like you're their friend, and they try to make like the reading an enjoyable experience. But with like the Marxist writers, it's like the language has been
encrypted.
It's not so much encrypted, but been very mechanized.
Yeah.
So it's like the equivalent of like reading, I just said his name. What was his name?
Tom something.
No. Oh, damn. No, Alexander Pope. It's like when you read Alexander Pope, he writes in an equally complex way in terms of like his grammar and his sentence structures and clauses and stuff. And his diction is also like very precise in the same way. But it's like he's doing that out of a sense of like beauty. But when you read like a Marxist and their like whole crypto terminology, it's like they're doing it out of a sense of like making the language like more mechanical and efficient or something.
That's what it is. It's a kind of brutalism of language. And I actually don't hate brutalism as much as a lot of people on Twitter seem to. I've been in some concrete buildings that, to be perfectly honest, I found pleasant. And I don't know what that says about me. But it's the idea of brutalism applied to language, I think. Like, you will read this and it will hurt. you won't be able to fit all the ideas in your mind's memory. You'll have to come back and deconstruct it. It's meant to be deconstructed, really. I don't think it's meant to be. It's like a parody. It's like, imagine if an architect built a parody of a house and said, well, you're going to live in this house? You're missing the point. This house is for living in. It's a statement on houses, you see. It's like that.
I want to ask you about, do you ever feel like sort of the architecture of how you browse the internet like infects your cognitive architecture? Like when I just couldn't remember the name of Alexander Pope after just saying his name, I felt like my phone does when it gets like overheated or something and it stops like loading. Like I'd lost something out of memory. It's like a very computerized thing, and sometimes I do worry about the structure of how I use the internet changes emulates itself in my mind.
I mean, I guess the question is, Does using the internet change the way your mind works? Maybe. I'm open to that. Or do you retrofit the way your mind works to this metaphor this idiom that you live? I don't know about you, but I mean, I pretty much live it constantly. Like whether I'm working or relaxing or what have you.
Yeah, that's
I don't
like,
know the answer.
yeah, I think it's the latter, because I also do that with like when you're bored online and you're just like checking the same thing, like the same two things, or like going back and forth, like looking for updates, and you keep like opening the same app or whatever. Like sometimes I find myself like thinking that way with like thoughts. It's just like, huh?
Yeah. Sometimes I will be browsing Twitter on my laptop, and then I'll close my laptop and I'll open my phone, and like a reflex, I will find myself on Twitter again.
Yes.
I can sort of hear people, like, I don't know, there's this kind of bravado you get from some people. It's like, oh, what a stupid cuck. Like, he can't turn off Twitter for 5 minutes. It's like, no, man, I can. But when you're idling, you just reach for these cycles.
Yeah, I definitely do have that, the cognitive idling sometimes, like when you're moving from one thing to another.
Yeah.
I love Twitter.
It's like going through.
Open a tab, open up Twitter again.
Yep. Well, you know, it's very common. Like just passing through a doorway seems to affect our memory. Like memory is very embodied, and everyone has the experience of like being in one room and then they go, "Oh, I went across the house to get something," and as soon as you walk through the door, you forget what that thing is. And the only way to remember sometimes is to walk back and put yourself in the situation that prompted the original move. And I think it's like that. We don't realize that like our behaviors, not only are they more routine than we think, but they're sort of arranged into macros. And if you notice them, they'd be kind of vertiginous.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like a lot of what I do is on autopilot, and basically every day. Like you don't realize how much of what you're doing, like putting on pants or something. It's like I'm thinking about something and then I have pants.
Yeah, you tie your shoes in the exact same way. Like I bet, like that's just a routine in your head. You know the way the fingers move, and the same with everything. I think about conversations. This is another thing, because two people who have a friendship, they interact in the same way over and over again. I try not to notice it, but you'll notice yourself having the same conversation or the same shaped interaction over and over again. It's like a certain person gives you a certain emotional payoff, so you predict them in a certain way over and over and over, and everything's these little patterns.
Yeah, people always make fun of like, coworker small talk, but it's exactly the same thing. I think with like people more. It's just that you have a larger vocabulary to construct from, so it seems like it's more diverse than it is. But when it's your coworker, it's like you only know like two things about each other. So your coworker will come up to you and just like say, like, "Hey man, like whatever the thing is that you said to him like that one time like 2 years ago when you talked." And it's like I told my coworker once, like I made like gnocchi at home, and then he came up to me every time I saw him for like 3 subsequent years and would say like, "You still make a gnocchi?" And I was like, "Sometimes, man. I don't know why you're so interested in that."
Like, no, dude, I made gnocchi once. It was all right.
But like, it's the same thing with like the people you know better too. It's just that you're not so limited that way. But the underlying structure does have that similarly, like repetitive structure to it.
Yeah, and you're not supposed to notice it, and like kind of in a way, if you do, it must mean something's wrong with you. It's like not in a sinister way, not like there's some cabal or something like that. But you really know, if you point these things out to people, they don't want to hear it, and maybe you don't want to hear it yourself. Like it's kind of a harmful perception. But I think the more you look at anything, the more it just sort of starts to fall apart. Either you vivisect it, or you dissolve it, or it becomes derealized in a way, to use one of those Marxist words.
Yeah, what do you think of deteriorization and like rhizomes and stuff? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I know. I mean, I use those words, but I don't use them in a way like, oh, I think that they're revealing something deep about the world. I see Deleuze as like this weird kind of Dada poetry, and part of the joke of Deleuze is that at least once an essay he insists that all of his concepts are rigorous and crisp and refer to real things. But like, that's part of the act, man. That's like there's 1,000 plateaus and there's rhizomes and like, okay, man, great. And by the way, I assure you, all of this is rigorous. Like, you know, it maps to the world one to one. But you know what a rhizome is, man? It's a piece of ginger. Like, go eat some Chinese food and tell me what you think about rhizomes. Like, it's an eternal middle. It has no end and no beginning, and when you chop it up and you put it in the ground, any piece of the ginger root can grow out to a whole ginger plant, basically. That's a rhizome. Okay, it's a cool metaphor. But it's you built your philosophy around a root.
Well, like, when you read Deleuze or something, it's completely ironic, is that I feel when you read him, it's like the same way as when you read like Diderot or something, and like Diderot's saying like, I'm being completely serious, this is like the most serious thing ever, and he just like keeps writing like that even though it's clearly not true. And that's how like all the postmodern philosophy is. So I also don't get like why the people who are so enmeshed in it don't realize that irony about it, and that they're
not in on the joke.
Like they write like that, and then they have absolutely no humor about the fact, like they think that it is real science, and like that when he says that he's being like super serious and that this is the most scientific idea that any person has ever had, they think that like he's being serious, and then they go and like try to recreate that. But I feel like a lot of the postmodern philosophy, it does come from this much longer tradition of like anti-philosophy, like Nietzsche, like, I'm not fucking around with your metaphysics, like here's some bullshit. Like they think that they take that and then they turn it into metaphysics.
Yeah, and it's not. And like, if you read Lacan, which I can't read French, but even in English, like a good translation that comes through, every other sentence is just a pun. Like, he's clearly it's dick jokes. It's very erudite dick jokes. It really is. And somehow people seem to, like, they admit it, but they won't. They aren't coming from the same spirit.
Yeah. So I think that kind of philosophy, that theory kind, is rightfully shit on. There's some people who are really like anti-academic literary writing, like at all, and they think that it's all crap. But then there is stuff out there of like people who just want to like autistically index like old works of literature, and who are like, here's a book with summaries of like all the reviews of this book from, you know, time to time in like this particular language or something, and they do like a whole survey. So there is lots of like useful stuff that can be found of that kind. But then the hardcore theory stuff, it is like total, like it doesn't have any value. Like if you're going to bother writing like academic work on a subject, you should make it valuable.
Yeah, I mean, so I read a quote from Shestov, well, his book, All Things Are Possible, and he says, we know nothing today about how to live, I'm paraphrasing, but we know nothing today about how to live that we didn't know, 3,000 years ago. I think that's mostly true. But I guess in philosophy, you kind of reinvent the same ideas, but hopefully in a way that maybe appeals or that's legible to your culture and to the people around you. But then at the same time, occasionally philosophy pays off like a trillion X. And the example of that, I think, is Claude Shannon. So you may be familiar with him. He was...
Yeah, why don't you give us a rundown?
Yeah, so I think he was an electrical engineer or something like that, but he learned in philosophy about Boolean logic. So before 1938, there were computers, but there was electricity, being used to electrical computers. There were mechanical computers, but to build a computer, you had to learn all these esoteric things. There was no sort of formalization of it. And Shannon, in 1938, he goes, wait a second, all your problems, like all of them across every computer, are actually reducible to Boolean algebra, to the philosophy of Boole. And like by taking this idea of binary logic, which he learned in a philosophy course, he made all of computers possible. He made computation possible in a way that it was never possible before. And I don't think that I don't think that people who are reading like Baudrillard or anyone like that really are going to find Boolean algebra. Like they're not going to find something that valuable. But philosophy does produce these things.
Yeah, and it is from the more metaphysical tradition. I mean, it does go back to like Leibniz and like his work on like binary. And I mean, I guess like most people should be familiar, but like the whole idea of the computer is that like the circuits are like a recreation of Boolean algebra, which is like a binary like algebra system for like logic. So like the circuits are like actually like one-to-one like physical like reconstructions of like the map of like Boolean algebra. But are you familiar with like Charles Babbage?
Not really, to be honest.
Oh.
I mean, I know about the difference engine from was it Neil Stephenson mostly.
That reminds me though of a Neil Stephenson book, his Baroque Cycle. Are you familiar with that?
I haven't read that one. And actually, with the difference engine, it might have been William Gibson. But either way, yeah, it was William Gibson. Anyway, you were saying.
I mean, that's an interesting book to check out. That's a big historical epic about like Newton and a bunch of early computer scientists, like who Neil Stephenson I guess considers to be like the founders of computer science, and then it connects with his later works and the characters that he uses in them that are more about the Alan Turing, like World War II sort of stuff. I guess you don't see the movies. You don't watch many movies, so you didn't see the Turing.
The Imitation Game.
I think I saw it. I saw the Imitation Game. Yeah.
I hated that movie because I felt like the structure of the movie, and this goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning of works of art that get their structure from like the subject matter of like what the work is about. So like my problem with the Turing movie was that it like the structure and like the way that the story was told, like the focus of it had nothing to do with like the problems that Turing worked on, which like come from problems in actual like philosophy that have a lot of profound significance. Would
you say the movie? I don't really recall its details, but would you say it was woke-washed?
That it was what?
It was woke. It was woke-washed.
I don't know. I don't remember so much that. I just remember hating it.
I watched it a couple days ago, actually.
Oh, yeah?
I kind of enjoyed it, but something we spoke about before is the intermittent like cutscenes that they do in movies now with flashbacks and things like that. I really didn't like that with it, and the only time they do talk about Turing's any of his philosophy or problems is in like a 2-minute scene out of the 2.5-hour movie where they ask him during the interrogation whether he thinks a machine can think, and then they go into that for about a minute and a half, very daftly, and that's about it. But I thought it was, I don't know, it was kind of just romanticized or idealized for Hollywood. It wasn't really if you're looking for a Turing movie, it's not the one.
Oh, did either of you see Hidden Figures?
I have not.
No.
What's that?
That's definitely a heavily woke-washed movie about like the black women who worked at NASA.
I think I read a review of this.
Yeah, and it's like, a very standard sort of like overcoming inequality movie where it has all those familiar beats, like the same ones that you can find in the Cuba Gooding Jr. movie where he's like a naval diver.
Oh yeah, I've seen that.
Yeah, it's like exactly like that. But in Hidden Figures, it's the same thing where like the main female character, the black woman who's like working on the rocket like trajectory, and she's coming up and solving the math.
The whole thing. She figures out
Yeah,
thing.
I saw a clip.
But like the way the movie is structured and stuff, it doesn't have anything to do with like that trajectory that she's working on. But and you can see like the exact opposite thing in like Gravity's Rainbow, where like the whole book is like structured like the arc of like the V2 rocket. So that's like the sort of the difference I'm talking about, is that if you're gonna like make a movie about like a super smart mathematician working on a rocket trajectory, that should influence like what the movie is about and like how it's structured. But they don't do that. So my problem with like woke washing, like the criticism of that, is that is true, but a lot of the times there's like a much deeper like aesthetic problem with the movie that derives from just how generic movies are in general when they're produced out of this system, and how the woke washing is like, that's something that's going to just come and go. Like Hollywood is just going to keep making these generic movies and then just paste on whatever it is at the time that appeals to their demographics the most.
Yeah, you've probably heard of a book called Save the Cat, which is kind of this like insider's guide to writing a Hollywood script. And the book is very short, but it describes something like 20 or 30 beats that a movie is supposed to hit, and it gives this very detailed structure for what a movie should look like. And basically every movie now is made to this exact structure. Like, and if you read the book, like, not that you couldn't pick out that it's formulaic, but you can really see, like, this is the exact formula, and every movie follows it pretty much to the letter.
That happened to me watching the series House. I was really into it, but then I fixated on it so much that I realized a pattern that between every commercial, it would be like two commercial breaks till they figured out what the problem was.
Yeah, all those shows, that always happens.
Yeah.
And then you were like watching like Law and Order SVU or whatever, and then at that point you can just like imagine your own episodes.
Right. Yeah.
We were talking the other day with some people about Seinfeld. I was talking to like Orc Brand about it, and how it's just like Seinfeld like writes itself, and some of these formulas just they are the mind viruses that we've spoken about. That you
I saw your Seinfeld tweet. It was good. It was very good.
Are you a Seinfeld fan? Let's turn this into the late night Seinfeld chat.
I'm so into it. I love Seinfeld. Like, that's one of my favorite shows growing up. I still quite enjoy it.
Yeah, that's what a lot of podcasts are about. There's a lot of ones out there that are just like, this is the Frasier podcast. That was sort of my inspiration for this one. This is the TekWars podcast.
Yeah, I think I told you. I was hoping that there'd be some like fictional TV show that this whole podcast would be centered around. But yeah, too much work.
We were talking about that. He thought that that we should come up with our own sci-fi show, and and just talk about it on this podcast as if it was real and all the guests would be in on it. But you're right that would take a long time to coordinate. But I'm actually working on something now that will help bring that idea to fruition. So, thank you for helping me realize the true purpose of this podcast.
Yeah, I mean, so when I first heard the name TekWars, I think because I saw someone who'd been on it early tweet, like, sometimes he tweeted, sometimes you get a guest who's in on it. And just like those few words, like I read into this whole thing, and I was imagining this science fiction show called TekWars. And like, I thought of like, what if someone just came on extemporaneously and I was like, oh yeah, I love the episode in season 5 where like Sophia, she gets trapped in the engine room. And you can just imagine like spinning a whole kind of made up fandom.
Yeah, that's the Voorhees in you.
The circular ruins. That's the story I was thinking of before that I couldn't remember.
That story is beautiful. Really beautifully written.
What's the plot of that one?
It's like a boy who gets stuck in a dream. You could probably tell it better than I.
Yeah, so in the circular ruins, Borges was very taken with sort of like Islamic mysticism. And he has this idea of a man who goes out into the forest to become a wizard. And he lives in this sort of Stonehenge-like structure. And he tries to create a man. He tries to dream a man. So his magic works by falling asleep and imagining a man. And he dreams of his feet, and he dreams of his hands, and he dreams of his hair, and he dreams of his eyes, and he dreams of his birth and his death and all this. And he's never able to dream another man into being. And then he makes a deal with fire, with the spirit of fire. And he says, the agreement they make is that he'll be able to dream this man and he'll be fully real, except he'll be immune to fire and he won't burn. And that'll be like his one sort of concession. I may be getting some of the details wrong, but that'll be his concession to the fact that it's a dream. And so in the story, the man dreams his new man, his fire immune man. He sends him off, and he's very pleased with himself. And then his ruins start to burn down, and he realizes that the fire does not burn him, but he himself is immune to fire, and that he was a dream of a wizard who made the very same deal.
It's very interesting. A mind like that is like imagining the brain is just a tesseract going in on itself or something, like something 5D. To think like that in those patterns, I don't know how it's done. It's immaculate.
Did you ever read Love? Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Did you ever read like Lovecraft's like first story about the man in like the castle?
Oh, it was his first story? Are you thinking of The Brain in the Jar?
I don't know. I don't remember the details. I remember like it's a very, very early one about a guy trapped
in the darkness.
Yeah.
Yeah, The Whisper in the Darkness. So this was quite a long one, and it's this whole sort of horror story. But at the end, the man realizes he's a brain in a jar.
Yeah, that's it.
Is that before or after the original like brain in a vat theory, or is that where that came from?
Well, according to the internet, it was published in 1930.
Huh. Okay.
But there are older stories about this, I think.
Right.
There was kind of this sort of idea of alchemists in like maybe the 1600s searching for a way to keep a human head alive. So they had this idea that maybe, you hook up the right tubes to the throat and you give it some air and you give it some water and, maybe you could have a human head decapitated, but they could speak and think and perceive and so on.
That goes back to like our discussion on collecting. Over time, these theories and writings and everything are collected and built upon one another.
Yeah, we have the true autistic canon of like literature throughout history to draw on. Did you ever read Lovecraft's history of weird fiction that he wrote? He has like a nonfiction essay about it.
I read a brief one. It was only maybe a few pages where he talks about sort of horror and what it means to him and how he thinks about it. I think Nick Land actually has linked to that essay a couple of times.
He actually has one that is a historical survey of like what he considers to be the genre of weird fiction. And there's a lot of great stories that he references in that are not very well known, but which are actually really cool. There's a Victorian one called The Great God Pan. Are you familiar with it?
Is that Arthur Machen?
I don't remember the author's name, but I remember reading it because of Lovecraft's essay, and I thought it was really killer.
The Great God, and yes, I was right. It is by Arthur Machen, or Machen. I really don't know how you say his nickname. That. Yeah, so I haven't read that one. I was reading some of his other short stories. He's a really interesting author. Very much a Lovecraftian flavor to him. I recommend him.
Yeah, that's really like the autist in me. Is like I have to do that thing. I have to like get the author and then find their essay about like the history of the literature that they care about, and then I have to like read everything that's listed in that essay.
Oh yeah, I was really disappointed because I found out that Lovecraft had written an essay about how to write horror, and I went digging it up and I found some weird anthology that it was published in. And at first it looked like it was a very long essay, like it was maybe like 100 pages or something like that. But then I found it, and I found that it was only like 3 pages, and it was in an anthology, and the anthology was 100 pages. I was very, very disappointed. But it proved to not even be useful. It was a bunch of like writing workshop tips about making your clauses agree and keeping your adjectives terse, that kind of thing. Very disappointing.
Is there any like definitive work on horror, do you think?
There probably is, but
have you read any that are like really good?
No. I think that I couldn't tell you exactly where I get these ideas. I think some of it did come from a Lovecraft essay. That horror really is about the outside, and I realized I could develop that a little bit more, which is that there's a kind of horror, a fear of what's outside you getting in, and then there's a horror that is a fear of what's inside you getting out. And sort of like the two genders, or some stupid meme like that. Like there's people who think, oh, the demons are inside me, and I need to regulate them. I need control. I need like an external locus to
deliverance. Right.
Yeah, and then there's people who think, oh, like the demons are outside. They're at the gates.
They're going to get me.
Yeah, we need to build the wall higher. We need to get a bunker. We need to keep them out.
That's really interesting.
Two very different orientations to horror. But I couldn't tell you where I read that, or if I just synthesized it, or what.
Are you a metal fan?
No, not really.
Because there is...
yeah.
Oh, there is some great stuff about like the relation, like transcendental horror and like metal. Excuse me.
I find it very overwhelming when I listen to metal. Like it completely fills the consciousness. It almost does feel like a violation to me in a way. Like speaking of the outside getting in, it's just I can't think or process anything when it's playing. It just commands all my attention. So I find it uncomfortable.
What sort of music are you into, if any?
I have really basic tastes, but I listen to a lot of video game soundtracks, especially non-vocal ones. I listen to future funk and old country and western music. I've been very taken with Muddy Robbins lately.
Do you use music a lot as like a backdrop for your imagination?
I think I mostly use it to drown out my open office. Perfectly honest.
Because I think soundtracks are good for that, and anime or like video game instrumentals, is that you can sort of just project on it. So I always find sometimes a particular song or something will arouse your imagination or help you imagine some sort of scenario. Like that you're like thinking about like writing or something, and you can just like listen to it over and over again and like sort of project onto it.
Because the purpose of that psalm was originally to make like to fit for a map or something, or to fit for some kind of theme of a level. So to have that as a backdrop is extremely useful, I think.
Yeah, for me, it's always a sense of transport. When I hear a song, like a familiar song, I think of the first time I heard it, or a really iconic time for me, personally, that I listen to it. So a lot of the time I'll listen to a song because I want that feeling again. I want to go back to the place where I heard the song.
Yeah.
Or the thought when I heard it.
Yeah, I do the same thing where I listen to songs, especially that I've heard in concert. Even when I didn't like them at first that much after the concert, and now years later, I find myself going back to the same songs, and there's so much more power to it.
Yeah, it's like a sensory hyperlink.
Yeah.
I'm sure you're familiar with Proust and his anecdote of the Madeleine, very famous one, where he tastes the Madeleine cookie, and suddenly it takes him back to his childhood, and his mother, I think, pouring him tea and serving him Madeleines, and he has this profound sense from the smell of the Madeleine, I think it is. So, music, it does much the same thing for me.
Yeah, just, thought in general is just so, like, associative. And I think a lot of people, do take that for granted. That's why I think the autistic collector mentality is so superior. Without that, you can't really properly, like, organize. You can't organize these associations.
Yeah, something I think about a lot, or that I sort of stress in my writing too, is how small people are. Like, we don't fit all that much in our heads, and you try. Like, I think the idea of the collector is like you try to populate your mental universe. You try to fill it with more things, and the more you put there, the more you can do with it, the more degrees of freedom you get in the mind.
Did you want to talk at all about your current contest that you're running?
I'll give it a brief shout out. To be perfectly honest, I think it's kind of lazy content. I mean, it's fun. Everyone likes a contest, right? And I get to tell jokes about weighted blankets. But I just, I had said something about, like, women can't let men have anything, not even autism. And then the next day I just thought about it some more, and I was like, I want to know who the most autistic person on Twitter is. I'm gonna put together a bracket. And at first I thought I was going to do something silly, like try to normalize everyone over their follower counts, or come up with some obscure formula so that you'd have to be sort of autistic even to follow it. But no one is going to appreciate that level of detail. So I just went with a standard seed bracket. But if you want to vote for your favorite autists, definitely check out my timeline. We're doing single elimination. We're going to find the most autistic person on Twitter. Should be a good time.
If you had asked me for advice before undertaking this project, I would have warned you against it, because the contest just, that you think that it's going to be easy, and then it ends up taking a lot more time and effort than you think, and then by the time it's like really like almost done, like people are just like over it.
Yeah, that was my worry. Is like, originally I was like, I'm going to do one a day, but then I had 60 nominees, and I said, oh shit, no one wants to see this for 2 months. I don't want to see this for 2 months. I'm going to bore myself. The idea of it bores me, right? So honestly, it's kind of low effort, but at the same time, I hope that everyone can kind of feel like, oh, I got some recognition for all this spurgy stuff that I'm doing. I guess try to spin it as a positive.
Yeah, that's always my problem when I post something like, oh, reply to this tweet and I'll like send you a music that I like, and then you think that like you're thinking of like a dozen songs or something that you wanted to recommend to people, and you just didn't really know how to get them all out there, and then you'll do that, and then you'll think like, oh, like only like a couple people are probably going to respond to this, and then there's like 80 people, and it's like you've been doing it for like 3 hours, and you're like, oh my god.
Did you get through all of it, Compot?
No, I just gave up.
One like, one unpopular opinion, 3,000 likes later, you're like, man, I don't even have that many opinions. What am I going to do? But speaking of music and threads and recommendations, you just made me think. There's one artist I really do enjoy, Modest Mouse.
Yeah.
So
Oh, yeah.
I kind of treated their body of work much the way that I've treated many books. And I was very, very interested in them. I listened to all of their albums, like over and over again. And I really found a lot that was interesting in that music.
I was just listening to This Is a Long Drive. I've been listening to it like all day. I don't know why. I draw a lot of power from it, I feel. Because it does take me back to like 2004, like high school. Like that.
Yeah, but that's Dramamine. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
That's such a good album.
There's my mental hyperlink is like taking me back to like AP Bio.
They have themes. What I really like about Isaac Brock is he has certain like motifs that just emerge over and over again in his music, certain phrases and certain pictures and images. And it creates this whole sort of culture. It's like a labyrinth in itself that you can walk through.
Yeah, that he does have that style. I mean, it's sort of like similar to Neutral Milk Hotel in that way. Is that this music in a strange way has its lore.
So I've never listened to Neutral Milk Hotel. I know the meme.
Yeah.
I've heard of it. I've never really done it. I don't know if my hipster power is quite that high.
Yeah, it's not my favorite album from Elephant Six. So that was the thing, is that Neutral Milk Hotel is from like the Elephant Six, like music collective or whatever from like Atlanta, and it just had a lot of different bands, and that was the one that a lot of people picked up on because it was on. It got a huge recommendation by like Pitchfork, like really early on. But then there was like another band called like Olivia Tremor Control, which I always thought was a lot better.
Okay, I'll take a look at that. I apologize, but I do need to be going pretty soon. I need to.
Yeah, that's perfect because we're at an hour and 20 minutes, so this is a great time for us to kind of wrap it up. Thanks everyone for listening to us.
Thank you for coming on.
Oh, thanks for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, this was a great one. I'm really happy with this one. I'm excited for people to listen to it. And if you're not already following, please go and check out Zero HP Lovecraft's Twitter account. And thanks again for coming, man, and we'd love to have you back.
Awesome. Have a good night.
You too.